Hello again, everybody. Okay, today I'm going to try to paint, see if I can describe what I'm up to here. A simplified urban scene, or how to take a really complex subject and make it doable a little more simple. That's one thing. I don't know if it's the main thing, though, I want to talk about. Or maybe it is, maybe it's the way to do that. A lot of ways to do that, and one is to think about complicated things like buildings more as shapes. I think of my paintings, any kind of painting, any subject, as really a collection of shapes, shapes of value, darks, lights, midtones. But if you think about a building with all of the, especially a classical building or even modernist buildings, many windows, doors, details, cornices, overhangs, setbacks, all the architectural tripwires. And if you put all that to the side, what you've got are just shapes. Anyway, I want to get real here. This is a reference photo I'm going to be not copying, but used as part of my inspiration. So here we are in New York City. This is Manhattan, and I'm on the island. I took the tramway over to Roosevelt Island, which is a strange, beautiful little place. But it offers many advantages. One is you get these unparalleled views of the Manhattan skyline. This is late in the day, sunset, and so the buildings, like I was saying a minute ago, really, because they're backlit, they're not receiving very much direct light, very little, if any. They read as shapes more than a collection of busy or difficult to draw details. And that's one way to think about them if you want to simplify your drawings. The 59th Street Bridge is another feature that I want to include. It's a little more intricate because of the lacy structure. The light that does exist shines through a bit. And I do want to make this sort of the focus of my painting, star of the show, if you will, or where there's any detail at all in the painting. Primarily, I want it to happen here. As I usually do, I do a setup sketch. This is a really scratchy, informal sketch, which frankly I think are often the best way to go. Just as a way to start to compose the visual elements of the painting you might want to do, but also to begin thinking about how you want to design the values. I see this in my mind's eye as a painting with light here in the sky, light here on the water. This is the East River. So there'll be two sort of competing highlights of the painting. This one I want the lightest. This one I want light, but not as light. I don't want to make them equal. So I want progressing amount of light coming from the horizon up, so the top of the sky will be not pure white, but lighter, and then the whole painting will get darker and darker as we come down to the horizon line here. So this is another way you can simplify an urban scene, that I'm really just going to be highlighting the silhouettes, the tops of the buildings as they stick up past the evening mist. Hopefully much of the painting in this area will just dissolve in that way watercolor can do, of bleeding out any detail and leaving a lot of room for the viewer's imagination. A little bit of foreground I want to include. It sort of shows in the reference photo, but not much. There are some quieter streets over here, some kids sitting on the dock looking. The contrast between the quiet and peace here and the noisier chaos of Manhattan just a little distance away was kind of compelling. So I want to make a little bit more of the foreground, and also as a way to anchor the building, anchor the painting. So this area will be quite dark. The people here will just be melting into the shadows. I definitely want to enhance this evening view where Another way to simplify urban scenes is to paint them in low lighting. So an evening view is an opportunity where you can bleed away detail, and a lot of shapes just bleed together. And yeah, so there really won't be much detail. As I say, a little bit here. I do want to work in one of these trolley cars, I think, but I moved it in the drawing that I just did. But anyway, that's my thinking about compositional shapes and values. I've moved some of the buildings around a little bit here. It's still a pretty recognizable scene. But as always, I just feel the need to not be nailed down to a reference photo, but that it's a starting point. And I can use these elements. I've zoomed in, as you can see. I've increased the heights of some of these buildings, moved them around a little bit, simplified here and there. But overall, it is a recognizable place and a recognizable scene. Another way to simplify not just urban views, but any painting you do, is by considering this often kicked around term, the limited palette. And that, of course, means just what it says, using fewer colors than you might normally. I'd like to do this all in ranges of warm tones, from yellows, oranges, we'll simplify the sky, to primarily browns, I think, for the dark buildings, maybe some deep blues in some of the shadow areas, but very, very limited color. And in an urban setting, this is a really good way to simplify your paintings too, if you want to, just by limiting the amount of things, the amount of detail, and then limiting the amount of colors, making this more of a value exercise. Light versus dark, lightest, almost lightest, all midtones, and the darker elements will happen. Here for sure, probably a little bit here to anchor, and then I want to end up with this sort of a triangulation of darks, connecting the light here to the light here. That's my design plan. Here's a sketch I just worked up, much like my loose, steady sketch, but I made a few little changes, added a few elements. I do want to include this silly trolley car tram. I just think it'll add an interesting note and another layer to work with. It will be dark too, so I'll have hopefully a good dialogue of darks triangulating in this way, and then again the light in the sky connecting to the light of the earth in the water here. All pretty simple stuff as far as coloration. Drawing wasn't really too hard. Again, there's very few details, a little bit in the bridge superstructure. Not too much is going to show in the supports and all of this urban junk down here. A little bit of busyness there, top of the support there maybe, and a little bit of finesse, I hope, in the profile of the dark shapes of the foreground. So little bits of detail is another great way to simplify your views. Little bits of detail can carry a lot of weight in a painting that's otherwise pretty simplistic and just shape-based. All right, so I mixed up my palette. I've avoided bright reds, I've avoided greens, I've avoided blues entirely for now at least. I may introduce some deeper ones later, but I've kept this into a palette of yellow. This is Naples yellow. This is permanent orange. It's a little dirtier than I wanted it, but that's okay. And then some violet here. This is actually, this isn't violet I'm using. I changed my mind. This is a neutral tint. There's no violet at all. I may drop some in to complement the yellows, but I'll just get started. the way to unify this whole painting is just to do one big overwash over everything up here down to the horizon. So this is just clear water at the top. Again, I don't want that to read as pure white, so I'm not going to leave too much pure water. And then just some light yellow to begin. Some of this permanent orange. This looks pretty bright, but it really won't be by the time I'm done. I think I might toggle this into a little bit of, dropped a little raw umber into this graded wash. This is a very traditional graded wash, which if you follow my videos, you've probably seen me do a million times. But it's a traditional way of painting in that you build up this bead of water. It's a Beaux-Arts technique I learned 100 years ago, and I'm still doing it. Traditionally, you use a mop brush or a brush that can hold a good deal of water. This isn't a very big painting, it's only a quarter sheet, but still, you want enough water in the brush that you can pull this bead across. In the olden days, the traditional method was not to even touch the paper, but just to pull that bead of water down. Into that bead, you can drop other pigments. This is some Van Dyke Brown. So the pigments will mix in that bead of water, and then you continue pulling this whole assembly down the page. It's a very easy technique to learn, and I recommend it especially for our liquid fluid medium watercolor, because you can easily change from one color to the next, one value or tone to the next. And it really does help enhance just the fluid nature of our beloved watercolor. So now I'm washing this down into this neutral tint. I did drop just a little bit of imperial purple into this darker wash. And I'm going to speed this up. I don't want to touch the water yet. I may leave it almost entirely untouched white paper. But at least for now, for this portion of the painting, I want to leave it untouched, because there'll be so little white truly saved in this painting. And as usual, once the white is gone, you cannot get it back. But if you save it, you can always eat it away later if you want to. I normally have my easel at about a 40-degree angle. I have it a little flatter just because it shows up on camera better. So I'm tilting it up with my left hand to give it a little more slope, a little more angle. And that's one of the great advantages in working in a fluid medium, and also in these graded washes, because you can easily modulate and moderate or increase the amount of gravity. Water runs downhill, so I've been told. So if you tilt the board up, it'll run down the page faster. If you lower it, it'll run slower. So that affects how it sinks into the paper, how the tones merge one into the next. Yeah, I rarely work, actually I never work with my board just fixed in one spot, and absolutely never just flat on the table. If you're not taking advantage of gravity while you're painting, you're really missing out on a very large percentage of what watercolor can do for you, and you're asking for a lot of trouble that you don't need, because A lot of painters complain about blossoms and streaks and all those nasty shapes that can form in a watercolor that we don't like. Honestly, honest to God, 90% of those things just vanish if you just give your board a little bit of gravity. So I dropped in little bit of blue just to add some variety, but it's ultramarine blue mixed with some gunk that was already in my palette, so it's not really a color. I didn't want it to be very bright. I just wanted to get a shadowy, dusky feeling down here at the bottom of the page. That big wash that I just did is already drying pretty quickly, so I misted it, as you can see, and that again will help mitigate or help guard against any of those streaks, blobs, blossoms that we may not want. You can see some forming here. Just add a little additional water with a mist gun, and for the most part they will vanish. I don't know if it's a downside, but it's certainly a characteristic of working in this traditional wash medium, is that when you end the wash, the bead stays on the paper. If you want to get rid of it, you can just touch that lightly with a paper towel, or what I find myself doing more often is taking a mop brush, pulling out some of the water. You just touch that, and much of that bead will siphon up into the drier brush, so you don't, so it doesn't run down. Also, if you let it dry with that big of a bead, it will leach back up into the not quite dried areas above and cause a lot of ugly streaking that you most likely do not want. But another thing you can do if you're brave, it's just a painting, so what do we got to lose? You can backwash it on purpose like this. Tilt the board around, up, down, left, right, and you can really create all kinds of interesting effects, in this case within that shadowy, darker area. And then lay it back down, not flat, but at a lesser tilt so the water runs back down, and you get some of these really nice effects going on. I love these wet washes while they're drying. Before they dry completely, I'm going to take here some teal and drop it into the wet wash so that it doesn't make a hard edge spot, but hopefully just makes a compelling but ambiguous color shift. I'm policing myself a little. I don't want to get into too much color on purpose. I want to keep this painting quite simple, so I think some of these color shifts are fine, but a few will go a long way. This value in the painting needs to be dark, not the darkest part, but dark. So sort of a dark mid-tone, I suppose. But again, I want it to look like it's detailed without actually being detailed. I don't want to paint in very much of any of the building identities down here. I want these buildings to just melt into the shadowy area at the bottom. And so that's why I'm thinking dropping in some colors into the wet will help, if I'm lucky, create that appealingly ambiguous tone where it looks like I've painted something, but I haven't really. This is some Holbein lavender, one of my fave colors. I'm just dropping it into the wet wash to run around again to seem like it might be some kind of detail showing through the dark, but not necessarily. All right, I think for now that's enough. So I pulled some of the water out of the brush, like I say, and I'm just siphoning up the bottom of this bead so it doesn't wash back up in and cause me too many unwanted blossoms. Some stuff's gonna go on down here in the foreground, fence signage. I'm not sure what, so I didn't want just a hard line there. Yeah, okay. Were I painting here alone quietly, I would probably go away for a few minutes and just allow this to dry. Because what I want to do next is start in painting the upper parts of these buildings and have them melt down. For that to work, this needs to be a little drier. So what I'm saying is I may take the hairdryer just to speed that process along. Don't like using the hairdryer, but needs must. You've probably heard me say before that I don't like using the hairdryer. The reasons are simple, a couple. If you paint quite wet this way and drop in colors, etc., I'm using a piece of Arches rough surface, 300 gram or 140 pound. But part of the beauty of this paper is it allows these colors to sink into the little divots, float over the little mountaintops. And it gives us additional depth and transparency to your painting. If it's quite wet and you hit it with a hairdryer, it literally blows the pigments out of the little dimples in the paper, and the wash is going to dry much more flat and with less character than if it were just allowed to air dry. Also, I can't stand the noise, but nonetheless, it's okay. This is going to get darker before I'm done, so there's no need to be too finicky about it. The shine is off, which means it's starting to dry, but it isn't dry at all yet. The top of the painting's much more dry, so I believe I can still start here and drop in some of the treatment of the background buildings. I sketched them in just as simple rectilinear shapes. So I am going to use mostly a series of flat brushes for this stage. I have a series of these beautiful Escoda Perla brushes from about 1/8 of an inch up to 1/4. They're really great at just indicating shapes and creating a straight line if you need to or want to. Oh yes, I couldn't find, this is the larger one. Not quite 1/4, but so I think for these most distant buildings, these two should be enough. Looking at my sketch, I do know that the buildings that are further away are going to have less, I don't want to say detail, but less presence because they'll have less saturation, less value. Here in the reference photo, you can see, even though these look fairly etched, they're much less dark than the foreground buildings. Things, as they get farther away, just tend to look less saturated. They also tend to look a little blue, but I'm going to try to avoid that. I think if I used any blue tones over this yellow and gold, I get some pretty foul looking green, so I don't want that. So for the most distant towers, I'm going to use just a little bit of the tone I've already used in the sky. This is that Daniel Smith permanent orange. I put a little bit of raw umber in it, so it's just a warm, light tone. And I'm using these flat brushes to be a little careful at the very top, and then I'm just allowing them to fade quickly. This amazing wedge-shaped building, built on the old Steinway site on West 57th, is, I think, the thinnest residential building, I don't know if it's in the world, certainly in the city. It's very, very tall and very, very thin. It's very harrowing if you travel up to the top floors. I believe most of the apartments are sold, but I also believe they're largely unoccupied. But that's another story. So, yeah, I'm just using simple, warm, fairly light tones to indicate these. Again, as the buildings start to get a little closer, I'll be adding some additional value. So, yep, this building is a little bit closer, so just in my palette I used a similar soup that I mixed up for these, but I dropped in a little bit of burnt umber, or Van Dyke brown, just to give it a little more presence. And then I'm using this 1/2 inch brush flat to just dry brush those building shapes down into my shadowy area below. Yeah, here you can see the hairdryer sped up the drawing in one area and not the other, so I'm getting a beginning of a blossom. I'm not too stressed because other tones are going to come over that and disguise it, so I'm not too worried. We worry so much about those blooms and blossoms, but often they're kind of attractive. I'd be lying if I said I still didn't wince, because if I didn't plan them, I don't want them, but they're rarely as much trouble as we pretend that they are. So what I'm doing in my mind as I'm painting is I'm just assessing how the values are looking. I did want light up here, but I didn't want it pure white. I think it's still okay, but it's a little brighter than I originally had in mind. If it turns out to be, as I continue, I can glaze over the whole top of the painting more near the end and knock it back a little, but so far it looks fine to me. We'll see. I think in the big picture, what you don't want is for this and this to be in direct competition. It's generally a bad idea to have pure white leading right off the page. Not always, but sometimes it tends to pull the viewer out of the painting. But again, so far, I'm not too worried. I'm never that worried. There's always something you can do. And if not, well, you can just start another painting. It's not the end of the world. Yes, I paint with my finger a lot, especially when I want to just feather something into another something. The big goal here is just to establish a subtle skyline of these background buildings, so that's all happening. This one I want to be much darker because it's much more forward, and I think I'm going to need the dark value to triangulate the overall composition. That said, this particular building isn't that critical or focal, so I don't want it to pull too much attention away from the bridge. So yes, it will be darker, but probably not as dark and obviously not as detailed. So I'm trying to just use very simple brush marks to show, as I said, a little bit of definition and clarity at the top, and then allow these shapes to just feather out as they come down. I do know overall this is going to want to be darker though, so I think I'll just try to at least begin to address that now. This is neutral tint that I mixed in a little bit of the Van Dyke brown, so it's a warmer, neutral, violet-y tone. For this stage, I think that's fine. I may go back and darken this a bit more before I'm done. Pretty sure I will. But that's good enough for now. Yeah, never be afraid to turn your paper around or over or upside down, whatever makes it easier to reach or to do whatever it is you're trying to do. This is a fairly large tower in the background, but you could make an argument that it should be darker, but I do not want it to compete with the bridge tower, so I'm keeping it a little lighter than I might normally think I should. All right. So my concentration is all on shapes and values at this point. I always build my paintings up from the lightest lights to the darkest darks. Most of my paintings are an exercise in midtones. So all I've been painting so far are midtones, from light midtones to darker midtones. None of the real darks have happened yet. The real lights, of course, are the untouched paper underneath. to all is well. I know this area is going to be sort of a highlight, and I don't see any reason for doing it just yet, because when I do it, I want to be sure I nail the values as close as I can get them. So I think I want to establish some of the other elements first. Then I'll have a better chance of getting the values just right. So to that end, my goal here, as I've said a few times, but it's to get the value right. But the main goal, and a little bit personal for me, is to resist the urge to detail or over render or explain it too much, but to purposefully keep it loose and suggestive and evocative, to keep it really as loose and watery as I can, is, I don't want to say it's hard for me, but I guess in truth it is hard for me. My habit or my tendency would be to want to illustrate, to show too many details. Sometimes that's correct, or the way you want to go. Sometimes that works for your painting. But in this particular case, I think it would be a bad mistake. So I'm going to try my very best to avoid that. So to that end, I'm reminding myself to just breathe. I'm using a flat brush. I think I may swap out later for something else. But for now, I think it'll be the best choice for me to let these various areas run together a bit more organically and to use some of these dry brush marks to my advantage. Dry brushing can make it look like something's quite detailed when it really isn't. So by that I mean you can imply a lot of detail that you haven't actually painted, especially if you're a fan, as I am, of this rough surfaced paper. Very often I get compliments online where people will say things like, "I love this painting, the details are amazing." And I am grateful, of course, but I also sometimes have to laugh and think, there are no details, or very, very few details. Areas like that, I didn't paint any details. I've just allowed the dry brush movement to allow certain tones to run together and the rough surface of the paper to look as if I've shown details that I honestly haven't. So it's all an area of midtone dark, or darker range of the midtones, but I'm trying to get a rhythm going of somewhat lighter to somewhat darker tones, all within that major range, if that makes sense. So within this area, there's no real lights, there's no real darks. It's all midtone, but it's a range of midtones from lighter to darker. Down here around the waterfront, there's all kinds of things going on. I'm trying my very best. Well, I've hidden the reference photo, that helps. But I'm trying my very best to just be, if not purely abstract, then just gestural, suggestive about shapes that could be something, may not be. Turning the board this way, and that can also help me, I think subconsciously, but it is pretty conscious. I mean, it's a choice. But to become less fixated, I suppose is the best word, on specific detail or identifying marks. If you're not looking at your drawing straight on, you can kind of fool your own eye into not being able to see quickly or right away what it is you're painting. And so it's easier to just then concentrate on shapes and tonalities. So color-wise, not much. I'm toggling between a little bit of this brighter tone I used up above, some of the orange. It's got a little bit of brown mixed in at this point, which was a mistake, but a good one. I think it's the way to go. A little bit of the darker Van Dyke brown, some raw umber, but all just warms merging together. So a good deal of this isn't really planned. I mean, the overall value design is planned, but where all these shapes are happening and what's going on exactly, I'm just watching the painting develop and trying to react to that in the moment. And I don't know, so far so good. Along the waterfront, I know that there's these kind of power substations, there's containers, temporary things, there's smaller buildings. Anyway, the point is there's all these shapes, many of them just rectilinear, that I can just indicate with a flat brush, not being specific about them, but just to try to imply general idea of shapes. Getting a little concerned here. This undefined area does have to resolve up into a more defined area. So this top of the bridge, I hadn't really planned how I want to do that. So I think it's going to have to start to resolve into a little bit more clarity, but I'm going to try to do it in a clever way. So it isn't just a hard line between clarity and obscurity. I'm using the flat brush again to hopefully help me get there. So over the whole area without sort of coloring within the lines, if you will, just making these general movements, dragging my arm through everything, and then seeing what that reveals. Here, some areas that are unpainted. Here, some areas that are. And then using the knife edge of the flat brush to imply a little bit more specific detail here and there, and hoping that this will sort of marry up with the more obscure areas down below. Oh, I think it will. It'll all be fine. Roosevelt Island, it's kind of amazing. They don't have a lot of, it's a little island right in the middle of the East River. So you can drive there, but you have to drive all the way over through Queens somehow. The more common way to get there from mainland Manhattan is to take the tram, this elevated tramway. It's kind of fun, and it's part of the MTA or the subway system. So it doesn't cost much, it's just the cost of a subway token. And you can ride over to Roosevelt Island, which is not very big, but there's very little commercial activity over there. There are cars, but not nearly like, I keep saying Manhattan, although Roosevelt Island's technically part of Manhattan, but it sure doesn't feel like it. And there are a lot of trees, parks, dog walking, biking, running. It's all kind of amazing. I live on the east side, and I can walk to the tram, which I sometimes do, and I just jump on it. I go over there for a couple of hours. It's a great place to sketch and paint and draw. And there's almost none of that going on over there. By that I mean the sonorous serenade of horns and sirens. There's this giant tower that supports, well, there's more than one, but this supports the tram. Very industrial, techy looking. I kind of love it. I want the top of it to be a little bit focal, but not to be in too much explicit detail, just enough. So we're not done here yet, but it's coming along. Generally, I like the transition from the dark, shady, more ambiguous part of the cityscape up to the more lucid profile of the towers up above. I think in this part of the painting so far, it's knitted together pretty well. Not so successfully here, but that's because I haven't put on the main bridge structure, but I think I'll start that now. Then I think the top of the painting will begin to marry better with the lower portion of the mid part. This is going to be a very dark foreground and pretty much the last thing to go on, so I'm not too worried about that. Just want to do whatever I'm going to do here first. Obviously this must be fleshed out pretty much completely before I tackle this. But the upper portion of the tramway support is, like I said a moment ago, I want a little bit of detail, but not too much. I want it to sort of support whatever I'm going to do on the main bridge, the beautiful 59th Street Bridge. So that's a little detail at the top. I think at this stage, probably plenty. Doesn't need much more. When I get quite close to done, I'll use a rigger or a small round brush and drag in some of the lines that support the tram cars. There are these beautiful little classical, neoclassical towers that stick up that are in front of this tower, obviously behind this tower, but the profile of it is beautiful, but also I think important for the composition that it be a little bit more fleshed out. So into that wet wash of raw umber, I'm just dropping in a little Van Dyke brown along the top, the profile of that tower. Okay. Right, now, theoretically, I know what I want to paint here. I'm trying to develop in my mind what I think will be a successful technical approach. By that I mean, I don't want it overly tight. I don't want anything in this painting to be overly tight. I just want a little bit of clarity to carry the day, and a lot of ambiguity and suggestiveness. So to that end, again, the top of these towers, I think, rightfully ought to be a little more clean and specific. But as we go down into the painting, they can become progressively less so. And again, I think as an approach, as a philosophical approach, that sounds good, but then how do you do that? What brushes do you pick up to make that happen? But the higher we get, the more, slightly more careful I'm being. I'm hoping just a little bit of lacy definition will be plenty for this whole sketchy painting. And yeah, I think it's working. This is just Van Dyke brown, nothing else going on up here. So I'm going to choose one of these Perla flat brushes, the Escodas, and try to indicate some of the cross bracing. I don't want it to be utterly tight and technical, so a little bit of dry brushing where the line breaks a bit, I think is not bad. The whole feeling of this painting, I definitely want it to feel like evening, where everything is a little quieter, but also a little less crisp and clean. I want things to be intentionally a little out of focus. I love that part of the day, the evening, where things are, I think too much. I'm smart enough to know how dumb I am. I think a lot about just the nature of times of day, and what is it about evening that feels so satisfying sometimes to us, to some of us, and unsettling to others of us. I think it's the part of it is the quality of visibility. Things begin to vanish, they're not as clear, they're not as obvious, and somehow I often feel my imagination coming to life when I can't make out everything I'm looking at, when I have to use my imagination to fill in the blanks a bit. I love that. And so I try to get that feeling, that experience into my paintings very often, where there's a little bit of clarity and then a little bit of that mystery as well. It's just a beautiful thing when it works well. Too much clarity can look stiff and dry. Too much mystery can feel unresolved, unhappily resolved, and unsatisfying sometimes. So I think it's just finding a balance. And I suppose that depends on our personalities too. There are very gorgeous paintings done by very dear friends of mine that are very, very, very specific on purpose. That's the intent. I mean, they couldn't be more technically impressive or beautiful. But that's what makes art so compelling, is that what one person does even if we can admire it, just isn't the kind of painting we may want to do. That's what's great about painting, not just in watercolor, but making art in general, is figuring out what resonates most profoundly with us. And there's not necessarily any right answer. I love very much, just in general, my way into painting, my way around painting. What excites me about painting, makes me want to do it, is trying to discover the collision of opposite things, where light collides with dark, where vertical energy collides with horizontal, with the past crashing into the present, with real things in some sort of dialogue with imaginary things, the real and the imagined smashing together. Oh, that's what I love. And so that's why I paint the kind of things I try to paint, where there's a little bit of quietness colliding with chaos, a little bit of detail or specificity colliding with the more gestural or the less defined. It's the opposites meeting on the surface of the paper that I absolutely love. So, as an instructor, many of my students love that philosophy, but some admittedly wish I was more the type of instructor that says, do this, don't do that. This is the right way, that's the wrong way. And I just don't do that. I can't do that. I don't believe that, so I can't teach that. So if any of you out there are looking for a way to improve, and I think we all are, don't look too closely at anybody else. They may tell you answers that are great, but those answers may be answers for them, not necessarily for you. But they might be too. I mean, I didn't invent water or color, obviously, so all of my theories are put together probably from work others have done before me. Anyway, I'm trying to make more concise videos here on YouTube. I a very low-tech way of just filming myself, but I'm looking at some video editors to try to get untenably long videos edited down in content, and maybe I would just do a voiceover or something like that. Anyway, I'm still figuring all this out, and I'm on a learning trajectory. But if you have any suggestions, please leave them below, the kind of approach you'd like me to take. I think there's some validity in this literally real-time approach. Watching somebody solve problems in real time, I think, can be very useful. And to a large degree, that's what painting is. It's solving a puzzle, answering a question, making real-time decisions, yes. So there's some validity to it probably, but it may not be for everybody, and it may not cover as many bases as I wish it did. But I like the format, and I think the potential there is there for some really good content. So you can see I'm being pretty careful up here, but also trying to fade it out the way I did these buildings to marry up the top to the bottom of the painting a little bit. I can see it. It's starting to happen. It's starting to work. Generally speaking, I think it feels good. I'm not unhappy with the amount of light up here. I think it still may prove to be a little too much, but I'm not so sure it is. It's quite wet still. So I'm going to add a little identity to the somewhat less illuminated sides of some of these buildings, just to give a little more texture to the upper portion of the painting. I'll tone down the shadier sides and still try to keep this pretty gestural and schematic. So some of these slightly illuminated right sides of these towers, I think, even though it's more specific, it actually helps build up this more abstract rhythm of dark and light within the mid-tone range. And I hesitate to put any more value over here, but I think I should, now that the bridge tower is more fleshed out. I think I can add a little bit of additional identity to this guy without messing anything up. As I said, I've hidden my reference photo from myself. A trick I do a lot, because otherwise I'll look at it and subconsciously think I've done any number of things wrong. And that just doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means I'll start to get seduced by strange details and things that really aren't going to help me or make the painting any better. Oh, but that said, I find myself wanting to look at it to teach myself about these bridge struts and braces, but the other side of my brain is telling me just not that important. It's just not. It's not a portrait of this bridge exactly. It's just a representation of the experience of this bridge. So I don't want to fall into the trap of doing a bridge portrait. I am assuming we would see this opposite side brace come down a little. Not adding this really to be technically accurate so much, but just to add a little more texture and flesh out the top. As I recall, there are some horizontals. And I'm sure there are some diagonals. And again, I'm not doing this to be technically accurate. I'm doing this to just add texture and filigree to the top of the painting. Yes, okay, for now I may come back and visit it. But now that's in, most of the big values of the painting are starting to come alive. None of the real deep darks are in. This starts to approach the early steps of the darkest dark. This will be quite dark, but I think under the bridge definitely wants to be darker, and I think this stone support could handle a little bit of identity without falling into the trap of being overly technical. So I'm going to mix up a little batch of Van Dyke Brown, a little less water in it, so it's a little, not opaque, but a little less fluid. I'll dry brush a few identity marks under the bridge. Here some smaller little blossoms happened, which I'm not just saying it, I rather like them, so not too worried about them. I'm going to leave them. They just sort of add some non-specific texture and grittiness. So yeah, this is Van Dyke Brown. Again, a little less water, and I'm using it to just add some character to the undersides of the bridge. Some of the bracing, yes, but also some deeper shadows under the span itself. Still being as mindful as I can to not be too technical. I think I can get away with a little bit of this architectural identity before it starts to fall into the trap of looking like a rendering or a technical drawing. I just love that, where clarity starts to melt into the shadows, where something looks both clear and unclear at once. When that effect works, it's really magical. When it doesn't work, it just looks confusing and vague. So I'm trying to aim for magical and not overly confusing and vague. Wish me luck. Yeah, that sort of vibe is working for me, and I think I'll just fade these shadows out, keep them intentionally vague and scratchy. Try to center the energy right there. Yeah, generally that worked. I want to do a little bit more there, but not too much. I think the general idea of what I'm trying to do is working. It's a little crisper, a little more obvious here, and then it still melts into the shadows. But keep that flavor going. There are some forward shapes I sketched in down here. I honestly don't know what they're supposed to be. Low buildings or containers or something. Let's just call them rectilinear somethings. Way over here, just behind the bridge, there are definitely some more forward lower structures or something. So I'll just include some shapes that I hope will be stand-ins for actual things. I do want a little more work on this tower. Let me dry this off. Trying to keep my videos to 90 minutes or less. So we're coming up on time, I just noted. So I'll try to get the major elements in and then finish it up off camera. I think when they're longer than that, the upload quality gets compromised and they don't look as high def as I'd like. And also they probably become just cumbersome to watch for many of you. The other option is I can do them in 2 pieces, and I'm not so sure how successful or popular that upload approach is. When I watch things, I don't know if I'd be too inspired to watch something in segments. So I'm trying to keep them all in one 90-minute or under shot. A fast painting is not always a good painting, but a 90-minute lesson I think is probably about maximum. So if I get all the major elements established and then finish up the smaller details off camera, I don't think anybody's missing out on too much. What this painting needs at this point is a balance of dark values. This begins to hint, this begins to hit at the darkest darks. This is darker mid-tone as it should be. I think this wants to be a bit darker. Definitely I want to establish the foreground. I do not think I want to have pure white in the river. I mean, I do want some, but not solidly pure white. So this is a flat brush of some of that light orange. I'm just going to drag it across. Just to keep it light, but knock back some of the white. Keeping a little of it. And under this more foreground building, I'm going to add some little sense of reflection in the river. Again, this isn't to be overly illustrative or accurate so much as it is to help focus the light here. under the nearer towers holding up the bridge, I want to do the same thing. What I'm keeping most in mind is, does it help or look good in the painting? Not is it accurate? Is it real? Those kinds of questions don't much concern me. It also, just a little hint of reflection will help in the end marry up the top and the bottom of the painting. Just under here, under the arch. Little hints of clarity. Hopefully a little will go a long way. I don't think it needs much. Just a little shadowing, and then I want to feather this down into the shadows. Okay, foreground. I'm going to start with pretty undiluted dark neutral tint for the tops of these figures, so I can maximize the amount of darkness against the light beyond. And I'll wash them down into some version of these tones, some browns, little bits of orange or whatever. I just want the tops of them to be quite dark. The bottoms of the figures can fade out a little in the fading light. And yeah, I'm being a little bit specific here, which I hope will make them feel more forward of all the more ambiguous stuff behind. There are these old-timey New York City street lamps. Which, you know, I could leave out, but I like the placement of them and sort of the contrasting nature of them. They're kind of small and delicate against this giant looming, more industrial structure beyond. So the approach I'm taking here is much like what I did when I started. I'm just drawing the profile of these dark shapes against the lighter tones beyond. But then as I get down here, I want them all to melt and blend into the overall dark foreground. Here, like the last lesson I did here on YouTube, I'm This is a demonstration of these darker tones with crisper edges feel more forward, more in front of the somewhat lighter tone with fuzzier edges beyond. So it helps create or enhance that illusion of three-dimensionality. Okay, now there are some, I don't know what's down here. I sort of made a lot of this up. But just for textural sake, I added some low-lying greenery just to kind of intentionally mess up this side. There's some kind of fencing and signage down here. I don't really know. Again, I really literally made it up, so it isn't real. Some sort of sign attached to the light standard. Keep it vague. I think this side probably wants a light post too. I didn't draw one, but I think I can quickly fake one in. Just get the bottom of it at least. I can flesh out the top later. So why I'm doing that now is I want to connect all these dark foreground edges with the overall foreground shape. So one good tip I'm always giving is if you want a shape to appear dark, but you don't want it to look necessarily dead and flat, it doesn't all have to be one solid dark tone. So if you get the edge crisp and fairly dark, the value you want, within the body of that overall dark shape, you can work in lighter tones. Here's some of that gold or orange. And even though this is quite considerably lighter and brighter, the overall shape will read as a consistent, coherent, dark shape. Then while it's wet, if you want, you can drop in some sense of texture or reflections, or shadows within shadows, or just tonality because you feel like it. This helps sort of connect the figures above to the shapes below. Again, hopefully enhancing that evening-like feeling. Putting in a lot of pigment right along the edge of that dark foreground shape and just letting it run down organically into the lighter goldy oranges that I painted in. And give it a little tilt just so they'll run more quickly and merge more gracefully. And again, that dark shape then does hang together as one coherent whole, but within that shape, there's some luminosity, some variation, some translucency, and it's just an effect I love. Because in watercolor, we don't really paint light, we reveal it. The light all comes from the white of the paper, of course. What we really paint are the darks. So given that that's true, you want your darks, at least you want the opportunity to make your darks as lively and as animated and translucent as you can, I believe. It's fair to say. This foreground tower, I really think needs to be a little darker, not quite this dark, but darker than it is. So this is just more of the Van Dyke brown. I'm hopefully going to just be able to feather this down into the foreground. I don't want this building to look disconnected from the composition, so I'll just feather it in. So the painting is nearly 100% complete at this point, so it's anything else I do, it's a matter of harmonizing and balancing out the values. I like this effect under the bridge, but I'm a little disappointed it's not a little more prominent. Watercolor does often look a little darker when it's wet, and I know that, but I calculated it would dry a little darker than it did. But it's all fine. Until you get all the values of the painting established, it's sometimes hard to be sure you've got the balance corrected. That's why doing a little value study up front before you start really helps. Doesn't always solve everything, but it gets you much closer. At least you know where you want your values to go. Much better. I think even the top could stand a little bit more value, but not too much. I think it's pretty good. I'm going to try to marry up these shapes a little. I'm going to take a couple minutes and just delineate the little cable car. Shouldn't take too long. It's a matter here of getting its value correct. It's not the darkest thing. It doesn't want to be the focus of the whole painting, but it's an important little value stepping stone as I see it to sort of connect all the other darks scattered throughout. In my longer classes, I have I teach all over the world live classes, but I have an online mentorship with Terracotta. And one thing I emphasize a great deal is connectedness. When you think of your paintings as a collection of shapes, value shapes, all those families of values need to connect. So it does not mean your darks have to physically touch, but they have to be designed so that they visually all work together and don't just look scattered without a plan throughout. And not surprisingly, the same thing with lights. They don't have to follow exactly the plan of darks. They certainly don't here. This light, they're in a dialogue. That one's stronger. This one's secondary, so that's the hero. But they interlock with your pattern of darks. It's just a really fun compositional game to play. So this is a very, very small Neef brush. It's not a rigger, it's just a small round brush. So I'm going to try to do some of the line work. Not a lot of water. I'm using almost no pressure, so I get kind of a start-stop effect to these lines, which I think looks better than if they're perfectly solid. Also, dry brush works. If the brush starts to run out of water, that's a good thing. You can get some of those scratchy skip marks that really do look good. So as this recedes to the other tower, I'm not reloading the brush, I'm just allowing the pigment to run out naturally. And that approach is generally enough to indicate some line work. It breaks up the sky a bit, adds a bit more texture and a little bit more logic to what's happening here, if you're a big fan of logic. I don't know if I am or not. But generally speaking, that's it. That's the look I wanted, this ambiguous evening, quietness to the chaos, quiet foreground over here with, I could see working in a little greenery that doesn't really exist might help hug this painting left and right. There are lots of trees over on Roosevelt Island. There aren't specifically too many right here, but I don't think anybody would be too angry if I made them up. I kind of think I will. Again, I've invented another street light. Just adds a little note of pastoral hominess. Yeah, I think some additional greenery that doesn't exist would, as a last-minute addition, I think not be a bad idea. But again, I want these trees to not really look like trees, just some ambiguous landscaping creeping in. Which brings me to a thought. Always when we do paintings, or say for instance, I'm painting in a tree here, philosophically, it's kind of hard to get ourselves to think we're not painting a tree. But we're kind of not. I mean, yeah, we are, but we're not painting a specific tree. We're painting a compositional element in our painting. So that means the look, the profile, the size, everything about that tree. The fact that it's a tree is not as important as the fact that it's an element in your painting. So you should design the shape, the format, the extent, the coverage, everything about that tree are just elements in your painting. The painting is what matters. The tree doesn't matter that much, is the point I'm trying to make. So when students especially are looking, as they should, for answers of how do you paint a tree, or how do you paint water, or how do you do this, or how do you do that? I'm a frustrating instructor because I'll never say, oh, you do this, you do that. I mean, I will if I'm forced, but the real answer is, it depends. I mean, I wouldn't paint a gray tree in many paintings, or a brown tree, but in this painting, that's what's needed. In another painting, another answer would be the one that would be needed. So the point is, you adapt your technique to fit the painting. You don't adapt your painting to fit a specific prescribed technique that some know-it-all instructor told you how to do. They may have the answers, but maybe not for your painting, and maybe not for you. It's your painting that matters, not the other way around. I got a comment the other day on my one of my drawing lessons here on YouTube, and someone asked me, almost frantically it seemed, if my technique could be adapted to work if they were left-handed. I have a lot of characteristic marks going through my painting drawings because I shade mostly in this direction. And it kind of broke my heart because, well, yes, of course it will work. What I do works for my drawing, but it doesn't have to be what works for yours. So just, I want to leave you all with that. What I do is fine. Again, I didn't invent water or color. You're welcome to any of the techniques or so-called answers I've found that might work for me, but please feel free to adapt them, reject them, restructure them, reuse them, however works for you. I could never paint like John Singer Sargent or anyone else, and I don't want to. I want to paint like me. You should want to paint like you, the best version of yourself. However you can get there, however long it might take, and believe me, it's never ending. But yeah, you can't paint like me, not that I'm so great, but you shouldn't want to. You should want to paint like you. And I could never paint like you. We all have a different creative DNA, and that's just the way it should be. Well, I've gone on a little longer than I wanted on this, but I did want to get some better balance going on overall, and I hope it was helpful. Again, the major lesson here, I went way off track in my rambling, but the major lesson here was intended to be how to use less elements, less drawing, less detail, less specificity, simplifying the painting of an urban scene. This one, a view of Manhattan from Roosevelt Island at night. But anyway, I've enjoyed painting this for you, and hope you got some useful pointers out of it, or things you can use or really don't want to use in your painting. That's all good. But thank you very much, and I'll post this all completely finished, though it's pretty close, when I'm done. And thank you very much for watching. Happy painting, and I'll see you soon.